Welcome back to the Rainbow Story Hub. You're listening to Talking Queer History with Dustin Scott, and this is part 2 of my episode with Ron Byers. On today's episode, we'll be discussing the origins of the Pride Festival within Edmonton, what it was like to be a gay man in the 80s when the HIV virus first came on the scene, and then Ron gets personal and tells us about his own personal struggles with the HIV virus. I hope you enjoy the episode. So you've been working on something for the Rainbow Story Hub, and it's about the difference between Pride in the US and Pride in Canada and the origins of Pride in Edmonton. Would you care to speak on that?
I think one of the most important things that we here in Edmonton have sort of lost to history, because there's been so much other history about how Pride started with the Stonewall riots and whatnot, that we forget our own history here in Canada. In fact, the Stonewall riots occurred 24 hours after BLC 150, which decriminalized homosexuality in Canada, was given royal assent. In other words, signed by the Governor General on behalf of the Queen. But it was actually approved in Parliament by all parties by a vote of 159 to 55 back on May 14th in 1969, which was a full 5-6 weeks prior to Stonewall taking place. So in Canada here, we had a legal right to exist decades before the United States and Stonewall. And for many years down in the US, Stonewall they held annual marches in memory of Stonewall. But it was because their police were still enforcing archaic laws down in the U.S. that that prohibited people from being gay and lesbian down there, and that was the case for many decades afterwards, before all 50 states had laws that basically decriminalized being homosexual. So their fights were totally different. Up here in Canada, I mean, we had our legal rights well before Stonewall actually happened. So we never felt a need to do a lot of Pride celebrations. What came after that is that we still didn't have laws that gave us our protections, or protections from discrimination. Those weren't baked into Bill C-150. They were other ones that we had to acquire through the various human rights legislations. And that took many years to get. In fact, it wasn't until 2009 here in Alberta that we finally acquired all our rights under the Alberta Human Rights Act that was passed. A very long time. Though the courts had read it in many years, it wasn't until they actually wrote the act. So Pride started here in Edmonton. There was sort of a Pride event in 1980. It was sort of a picnic put on together by one of the groups that was around at that time. And they held some picnic and barbecue and some softball games. And it was held on a place called Camp Harris, which is sort of a quasi-military base. It was the home of the 49th Loyal Regiment. Dated back many years. It was just outside of the city in Winterburn. And they allowed the group to come out and hold a big picnic on their facility. 1981 was the year the Pisces bathhouse was raided, and not having any formalized Pride structure, we didn't really do anything. Our form of protest against that police overreach at that time was that a couple of folks in our community, some leaders in our community, put together a float for the Klondike Days sourdough raft race, which took place in mid-July. And they floated the SS Pisces down the North Saskatchewan River to draw attention to the fact that this raid happened, and we're here in queer sort of thing. And it wasn't until 1983 that a couple of community groups got together and decided to have a celebration of who we are as a people, bring awareness to the community, and to continue advocating for further protections under the law, so that we could marry, so we could have children, so we didn't get kicked out of our apartments. And these are all, discriminations from our general community. So that's kind of where Pride began. I mean, there'll be a story being published on the Rainbow Story Hub down the road that people might want to tune into and check out more on how Pride started in those first 21 years. And then we'll have another story which kind of takes it to present day.
The SS Pisces is a great name. That's very funny. I like that a lot. Unfortunately, though, on a much more serious note, we can't really talk about LGBTQS plus history in Edmonton without discussing the impacts of HIV. What was the reaction within the community, in 1983, early 1984?
Go back earlier in our conversation, I talked about the first Pride being in 1983, where a group of people got put together this Pride celebration, Pride through Unity, and in 1983, that was what we had, was to build off of what had happened at Pisces Spa, and to start advancing our awareness in rights. 1984 was a different story. Early in 1984, we had been hearing stories coming out of San Francisco in particular, starting in 82, 83. In 84, those stories became louder and louder. And so one of our longest running gay organization in Alberta, the Imperial Svoerign Court Wild Rose, held an event at Flashback in early 1984. It raised $805 for as yet an unnamed AIDS advocacy group. None had been developed at that point in time. And then on Canada Day in 1984, and this story is out there, Michael Fair was hosting a Canada Day party, and they got a call from the Journal who wanted feedback on this newly diagnosed AIDS patient in Edmonton. And so Michael asked for some time, and went back and sort of created a committee, I guess, to help with this. Now, that patient, of course, is Ross Armstrong, and the HIV Edmonton building is named after Ross Armstrong. That $805 that the Imperial Svoerign Court of Wild Rose had raised earlier in 1984 was earmarked for a project. And as Michael put together this committee in July of 84, as it worked towards its goals as a subcommittee of GALA, if I remember right, or was it GATE? It was a subcommittee of one of the two groups. Anyway, they eventually were given that money and allowed to form the AIDS Network of Edmonton in 1985. So that became the basis of our AIDS information. That AIDS Network of Edmonton eventually became known as HIV Edmonton. So the Imperial Svoerign Court of the Wild Rose raised that first $805, which became HIV Edmonton. The AIDS impact hit us first. Ross Armstrong being the first to diagnose, he was certainly by no means the last. So by the time Pride 1985 came around, we were in mourning. We were working now with so many friends who had died in the previous month or previous year. And that only, as the years went on, that was what we dealt with. Like I had so many friends and acquaintances, well over 50 or 60, that had died within a 10-year period, that got to the point where I just couldn't go to funerals. And the only funerals I've gone to since then were my immediate family, because I just that's trauma that I have to deal with, right? So then the Pride celebrations became more about the oppression that we were facing, not from police or anywhere else. It was the oppression we were facing from the health community. You would go into a doctor's office, and if they thought you were gay, they put on the masks and gowns and gloves that you see today with COVID-19. That is what a gay person faced with a sore thumb in the early 80s, while they were still trying to figure it all out. And quite often they were segregated. Family wasn't allowed put in to be with their loved ones. Many people died without family around them. So many parallels to what's happened with COVID-19. But that was our reality. We were being the health community in Edmonton had no knowledge of this. So Pride kind of developed into and bringing more awareness of us as a community, but us as a community which has to deal with AIDS as well. We quite often the AIDS celebrations were included, memorials or moments of silence and remembrance of so many people that got lost to the disease.
And what was the political response like at that time? Like, I mean, I wasn't alive, so I guess I don't really know. Was it discriminatory? Were people discriminatory about the idea of maybe they could get AIDS because you were gay? Like, was there any of that going on, or?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think in the early years, people didn't know if you touched a gay person, if you could get AIDS. If you sat next to them on a bus, could you get AIDS? If you kissed them, could you get AIDS? That was real. I mean, the beginnings of our COVID-19 is what we experienced at the beginnings of the AIDS epidemic, where you had no concept of how it was transmitted. So, I mean, all those questions. But back then, it was even more fearful because you died. There was no cure. The government, for a long time, did not provide funding programs, both the provincial government and the federal governments. It took many, many, many years before they finally developed programs to help with the treatment of AIDS. It was the drag community across North America that stepped up to the plate to provide all those initial funds for AIDS research, for AIDS healthcare, for hospices. It was drag queens who did that, and a good part of that was the Imperial Court system, which at that point in time was up and down mostly the Western Seaboard, running from San Francisco up to Vancouver. And since that point in time, locally, our chapter, the Imperial Svoerign Court, the Wild Rose, plus the international chapters have raised millions of dollars and donated it to AIDS research, to AIDS healthcare, to a number of AIDS-related projects. Now that there's more funding available from the government, and the government is far more open to funding sources, funding needs within our community, and not only here, but also right across North America, the need for the drag queens to get out in their heels and raise money isn't anywhere near what it used to be. So they've channeled those efforts that they now are well experienced at, getting money out of people's pockets. And now most of the drag communities across North America raise money for local charities, Edmonton Big Sisters organization, the Edmonton Stollery Foundation. There is a literal long list of charities locally that our chapter has donated, hundreds of thousands of dollars to.
So not all heroes wear capes, then, is what I'm hearing. That's rad. I didn't know that. Curious now, though, like what the reaction within the queer community was. Do you feel that it kind of brought you guys together as saying, like, look, we need to raise awareness for this, like people are dying? Or do you think it might have drove people kind of back into the closet?
There were two paths that people kind of took at that point in time. And one was, yes, we need to advocate more within the community. We need to, make these people know that we're not monsters, that they can touch us if they want, that we're not going to give them AIDS just by looking at us. And the other part of our community freaked out and said, I can't deal with this. And a lot of them stopped having sex. Some of them stopped going out socially. Some of them went back so far into their closet that, daylight wasn't seen for many decades. But that was, that's what we had to deal with because, they didn't know all the information that we know today. So it was very much two different paths. Some just walked away and others walked into it.
I'm sorry. Did you just say that you were HIV positive?
Yes, yeah. One of the podcasts on there is one of the early ones, and it does talk about my history as an HIV positive person and the setbacks I've had to deal with and the arrogance of health professionals who I deal with to this day. It is stunning to me that that such a high level of arrogance and ego guides their treatment plans and how they care for patients, and it's just stunning. My health started to decline to a point where I could no longer work, and I was on assured income for the severely handicapped age, and spent a number of years on that until I turned 65, and then I was moved on to seniors benefits. But trying to get to the bottom of why my body was failing, and taking me closer and closer every day to dying. They weren't willing to do what was needed to be done, and I really had to advocate hard and firmly, and go through doctors until I find ones that were willing to hear me, not just listen to me. And it ended up in 2018, I was able to get the treatment plans that I had put together, and that has changed my life dramatically, from a point where I was in diapers. I couldn't go out of my apartment. I was a shut-in. I had barely the strength to walk up the stairs to my building. I was like losing weight despite eating as much as what a normal heavy person would eat. It was just going right through me. I was down to 48 kilograms. Once I got onto the treatment options and they started listening, I've literally put on like 30 kilograms in the last couple of years. My energy level is quasi at the moment, because I've spent 2 years in the pandemic on my couch, which is unfortunate. But at least there's opportunity for me to rebuild that. I'm still fighting with them. I'm still fighting with other challenges brought on by AZT. The biggest challenge was I was on AZT, which is an HIV medication, and it's known for being toxic on the body, and it seriously messed up my body functions. So what I'm doing now is trying to counteract what the damage that it did. It'll never cure it. It'll never correct it. I just have to manage it.
When were you diagnosed, if you don't mind me asking?
I was diagnosed April 20th, 1998, and I was told to get my affairs in order because I had very few years to live.
Even back then, they thought it was.
I was diagnosed with pneumocystis pneumonia. I was diagnosed with full-blown AIDS.
Oh.
Pneumocystis pneumonia, a number of other opportunistic infections as well. So I definitely qualified for the AIDS. Yeah. My doctor, who was the premier doctor in Edmonton that developed specific HIV patient care, Dr. Barbara Romanowski. She was an amazing person, but she also had far too many patients die on her. So she knew the reality. She knew that my life likely only had a year or two left. And she made that very clear up front. And I've managed to, I don't know whether I'm stubborn or I just refuse to die or what it is. I managed to rebuild my health a bit, and then it started going down again until 2010. And then it just kept declining to the point in 2016, I was barely able to move. And the infectious disease doctors were no help at all. So I had to turn to my family doctor, who was very supportive, and finally get on medication, which I had to advocate to get approved. I literally had to send a request to live to the province of Alberta in order to get the medication so that I would live.
Damn,
yeah.
So you went from having full-blown AIDS to back to HIV positive?
In theory, you don't really go away from being, classified as AIDS.
Yeah.
My HIV level, HIV detection level has been undetectable since the early 2000s. I went through a period around 2000 where I thought, why the fuck am I doing this? I just quit all the medications and I was just going to let the disease take over and kill me. Wow. I was prepared at that point. Someone talked me into taking the medication. So it took a couple of years. In 2003, I think, I became undetectable, and it's been that way ever since. But things like my CD4 count is at the lowest possible baseline. So that determines my immunity levels. I'm barely at the baseline bottom level, and it fluctuates up and down above that line. So, there's still challenges. So there are still the impacts of AIDS that mean that I'm not necessarily not AIDS.
Yeah. And so to treat AIDS, and sorry, I'm just curious now, they give you a series of like immunosuppressants, or how do they?
So yeah, in 1998, there was a number of different treatment options. What they discovered was, some of the early drugs were really bad, DDC and DDL, and I'm not going to try and pronounce their actual names, and AZT. And they were sort of the first 3 or 4 drugs that were used for HIV treatment. And they were harsh. They were harsh on the body. And so they started developing these other things that attack different areas of it. And they come up with a treatment option plan that included multiple medications that would attack from different levels. Each one had a different level. And man, like I was on DDC, I was on DDL, I was on AZT. They're also toxic to the body, and I'm living with that as a result. But some of the newer ones became easier to handle. But there was one medication I was on. I would have to take a couple pills every 2 hours for the entire day, and then other pills on top of that, a couple times a day, and then other pills on top of that, and then more pills on top of that. And you're walking around with this tub full of pills that you're feeding into your body, and it's like, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. I just don't want to do that. And some of them had terrible side effects. Some kept you up with wild nightmares, kept you awake at night. Some caused you to drench the bed every night in sweat. They were nasty. So I mean, as more and more medications came along, they became far easier on the body. There's a lot of new ones now that it can be taken 1 pill a day, and it completely suppresses the HIV virus to undetectable. So it got a long way, but man, yeah, it was those first few years, and the medications were really rough.
Yeah, I sympathize because I had a double lung transplant about 10 years ago. And similar thing, the first couple of years when you're on the new medications, the immunosuppressants, they destroy your body, and it's harder to get used to those than it is to deal with some of the sicknesses.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, now things have kind of balanced out a little bit, so things are definitely a lot better. But I'm happy that you're feeling a lot better.
Yeah. Still dealing with doctors though. I mean, I went and saw a neurologist because back in 2011, my head started being painful. It's like having the worst hangover without the effects of the alcohol, just the head being so strong. Yeah. And some days it gets to the point where my vision gets unfocused and I can barely stand. And I've been dealing with that since 2011. And I saw a number of doctors. Nobody was able to treat it properly. I finally decided it was time to redo it again because it's gotten worse over the last year. My vision is really out at times. And I went and saw a fellow that knew that I had been impacted by mitochondrial toxicity. He was advised by a letter a couple of years ago. He was advised by the referral letter from my endocrinologist in December. And so I met with him in January, and the first thing he did was prescribe a different treatment option, which was kind of hopeful because everybody else thought it was one thing and nobody else would go off of that vein. He went in a different route and prescribed a medication. And after about 10 days of taking it, all my symptoms came back. I'd literally gone back 8 years and then when I looked it up, well, the medication he prescribed is known to cause mitochondrial toxicity. Oh. It is known to cause all the symptoms that it was causing. So he just literally ignored my other medical conditions and prescribed a medication that just reversed it all.
Oh, that is brutal.
Ugh. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry that you've had such a hard time with doctors. That's rough. You would think they would know better by now, right?
What I have found is that their arrogance means that they know everything. They don't sit at night and Google new research. They certainly don't go, and sit down in the library and learn new stuff. They assume everything that they got taught is all they need to know. And they don't go beyond their examination room doors. Yeah. They just don't go out past those 4 walls, define their world. So in order for me to get to the treatment point, I literally had to compile. I've got hundreds of documents and new research, because research on mitochondrial dysfunction has only been able to be taken place in the last 10 years because of technology and advances in science. So none of the doctors that I've seen would have known anything about this because it wasn't taught in school. So, and they won't listen. If you go in and say, I got this off Google, they go, yep, go away.
Do you think that played into how they were treating this in the late 80s, early 90s?
Um, yes, they didn't know what it was, and there was very little information, and research was only just beginning, and the technology and science behind what the available avenues of research was minimal at the time. So the how they treated patients who were HIV positive and just gay people in general was all based on their knowledge and schooling that had, may have been done 20 years or 30 years earlier, and as a result of that, they often gave poor advice. They often gave advice that wasn't based on anything they learned. It definitely had an impact on why people who were HIV positive in the 80s and 90s were treated so badly by health professionals. Right. Fortunately, a lot of that has changed for the better now.
Oh, thank God. Okay.
No, actually in Edmonton we have two places. They're part of what's called the Northern Alberta program. It deals with HIV patients. They chose not to use the word HIV in the name. There are two centres. One is located at the HIV Edmonton Clinic on the third floor, and the other one is located in one of the buildings at Royal Alec Hospital. And they are staffed by a multifunctional or a multidisciplinary team. So they've got a pharmacist on staff, they have a couple of nurses on staff, they have a psychologist on staff, they have doctors on staff, various disciplines, including the family doctor. So they've got a whole holistic approach in dealing with them, and even dietitians on staff in both locations. So, if you are HIV positive, the resources that we have now are vastly different because we have the ability to access, kind of a multidisciplinary environment that can look at whatever it is we're bringing into.
Good. Very happy to hear that there's some positives coming out of this, especially for the HIV positive community.
Yes.
And that wraps up my conversation with Ron Byers. I just want to thank him again for sharing his time and all of those stories with us, especially the ones in this episode. I know they were deeply personal, but I greatly appreciated it, and I hope everyone else did too, and I hope you all enjoyed listening. Stay tuned for further episodes here on the Rainbow Story Hub. Thank you.